Scott Steiner was one of the most jacked humans on the planet during his prime. But what does he look like today? Stars like Batista and Triple H made entire careers out of their insane physiques. But what happened once they got off the sauce? In this video, we'll answer all that and a lot more as we look at the WWE legends who completely lost their physique, starting with none other than the Animal. Batista walked into the WWE during the early 2000s looking like he'd been carved out of granite. At his peak, he was pushing close to 290 pounds of pure muscle, and he wasn't just big for the sake of being big. He moved like an actual powerhouse. Every clothesline felt like a car crash. Every spear felt devastating. He held the World Heavyweight Championship multiple times, and for years, he was the literal template of what Vince McMahon wanted a top guy to look like. But once Batista left WWE for Hollywood, his physique did a complete 180. In 2023, prepping for the psychological thriller Knock at the Cabin, the director wanted him to look like an intimidating, hulking presence, not a shredded powerlifter. So Batista bulked up fast, eating pancakes and french fries between takes, and ballooned to around 315 pounds. In his own words, it got uncomfortably big, and it happened so quickly that his body didn't handle it well. Once the film wrapped, Batista said the weight took forever to come off, so he leaned into jiu-jitsu, training for hours at a time, and slowly stripped the weight away. But then, Big Dave underwent another drastic change. He showed up in 2024 at a red carpet event looking slimmer than ever and lighter than most cruiserweights he used to destroy in the ring during his wrestling days. Batista has said that the transformation has been completely intentional because he didn't want to look like a gorilla standing next to other Hollywood stars. He's the lightest he's been since he was a teenager, and he sacrificed the mass that made him a wrestling icon in exchange for range as an actor. But while Batista's transformation might be intentional, this next wrestler went from having one of the most inspiring physiques of all time to fighting just to stand on his own 2 feet again. Before Lex Luger ever stepped into a wrestling ring, he was already an elite athlete, playing football at Penn State and the University of Miami. But when he transitioned into professional wrestling, he looked like he'd been built in a lab specifically to intimidate people. Vince McMahon knew exactly what he had and introduced Luger as the narcissist, a character who'd literally pose in the mirror before matches just to show off a physique fans genuinely couldn't believe. For a stretch in the early 90s, there might not have been a more physically dominant look in the entire industry. Luger never quite made it to the top of the wrestling industry, but his physique always remained a strong point. But then came October 19, 2007. Luger suffered a nerve impingement in his neck that caused a spinal stroke, leaving him temporarily paralyzed. By 2014, he was relying on a wheelchair full-time. He could live independently, feed himself, and get by day to day. But the man who once had arguably the most beautiful physique in wrestling had lost nearly all voluntary control of his own body. For years, that seemed like the end of the story. But then, Luger connected with longtime friend and fellow Hall of Famer Diamond Dallas Page, and the two began a slow rehabilitation process using DDP yoga. By February 2025, Luger was able to stand up from his wheelchair completely unassisted for the first time in nearly 2 decades. It's not the transformation anyone expected, but it might be the most meaningful one on this entire list. And speaking of physiques undone by the body giving out, our next wrestler built one of the most feared frames in history, only to watch his own heart nearly take it all away. By the early 2000s, Triple H had built a physique that matched his nickname perfectly. The game looked like he belonged on the cover of a bodybuilding magazine, all thick, dense muscle with the kind of conditioning that made him look like a main event monster. Even in the later stages of his career, he found ways to bounce back into peak shape, always maintaining an impressive physique even during his battles against Daniel Bryan, Seth Rollins, and Roman Reigns. But everything changed in September 2021. Triple H came down with viral pneumonia that rapidly spiraled into something far more serious. His wife Stephanie McMahon noticed he was coughing up blood and urged him to get checked immediately. Doctors discovered fluid around his lungs and heart, and his ejection fraction, a measurement of how efficiently the heart pumps blood with a healthy range around 55 to 60%, had collapsed to just 12% by the next morning. He was in severe heart failure and at the 1-yard line of the worst possible outcome. Doctors performed emergency surgery at Yale New Haven Hospital, later confirming the cardiac event was caused by an underlying genetic heart condition and fitted him with a defibrillator. By March 2022, Triple H announced he would never wrestle in a ring again, a decision made largely for him by his own heart. Intense physical exertion, the kind of training that had defined his entire adult life, was simply no longer an option. And as has happened with virtually every wrestler who's ever come off a serious training regimen, his muscle definition softened and the once chiseled frame gave way to something far less sculpted. Photos of Triple H in the years since, including candid shots on vacation with his wife and kids, have shown a visibly different man than the one fans watched dominate WrestleMania main events for years. The difference with Triple H's story is that he didn't need his physique anymore, because his job title changed entirely. But while Triple H lost his physique to a medical emergency completely outside his control, our next legend's transformation became one of the most debated things in the history of pop culture. For most of his wrestling career, The Rock had a lean, athletic build. He was muscular, but nothing close to the size people associate with him today. That changed years later, deep into his Hollywood run, when his physique ballooned into something almost unrecognizable. Thick arms, a massive chest, a level of vascularity that looked like a competitive bodybuilder. That shift has fueled years of speculation. Fitness analysts like Derek from More Plates, More Dates have broken down his physique in detail. Even Joe Rogan has said flatly, there's no chance he's doing it clean at his age, pointing out that natural testosterone decline after 40 makes that level of size and conditioning almost impossible to maintain without roids. The Rock has always attributed it to nothing but hard work in his personal gym, but the skepticism around him has never really gone away. Then, in 2025, something shifted again. Fans were stunned when he showed up at the Venice Film Festival looking dramatically slimmer than the version they'd grown used to seeing for years. He explained the change as intentional weight loss for an upcoming film role, saying he wanted to finally be taken seriously as a dramatic actor after years of being typecast in the same action roles. Predictably, the rumors started right back up, with plenty of people speculating he'd simply come off whatever he'd been using. Whatever the real explanation is, the shift has been dramatic enough that his most jacked-up era is probably behind him for good. Whether steroids, hard work, or some mix of both built that body in the first place, The Rock's physique has clearly entered a new chapter. But while his transformation played out under the bright lights of Hollywood, our next wrestler's transformation took place inside the ring right in front of us wrestling fans. Chris Jericho was never the biggest name in the locker room, and that was always part of his appeal. Across his runs in WCW and WWE, Jericho built his career around a rock star persona that made him feel bigger than his actual frame. Even without a bodybuilder's physique, Jericho stayed in consistently strong, athletic shape for the better part of 3 decades. However, around 2020, Jericho gained massive amounts of weight while wrestling in AEW and New Japan. Jericho has claimed the transformation to be intentional as he was going for a bulkier, villainous look for the Japanese audience, but fans were quick to troll Y2J's new physique. In recent years, he's looked visibly leaner and more conditioned, particularly during his return to All Elite Wrestling in 2026. What makes Jericho different from most of the wrestlers on this list is that there was never one single moment or public scandal tied to his transformation. And in an industry littered with cautionary tales, there's something almost admirable about a guy who's still lacing up boots deep into his 50s. Unfortunately, the same can't be said about the next wrestler on our list. Jake Roberts didn't look like Lex Luger or the other muscle-bound stars of his era, but he was lean, athletic, and one of the most intimidating performers wrestling has ever produced. The DDT, the snake, the promos that made grown adults uncomfortable. Roberts didn't need size to be one of the most memorable characters of his generation. However, things changed dramatically after his in-ring career wound down. Roberts struggled for years with addiction to drugs and alcohol, and by the time he retired in 2008, his health had deteriorated badly. He'd checked himself into rehab the year before, but the damage was already piling up. As the years went on, his weight climbed past 300 pounds, and he found himself financially troubled and barely functional. The turnaround came when Roberts moved into Diamond Dallas Page's Atlanta home, immersing himself in a supportive, structured environment for the first time in years. Using DDP yoga, Roberts lost around 70 pounds and rebuilt both his health and his self-respect. He's described the experience as life-saving, and that turnaround led to a WWE Hall of Fame induction in 2014 and a level of stability in his later years that once seemed completely out of reach. Roberts never got his old physique back, and he was never trying to. What he got back was his life. However, not every wrestler on this list who lost their body managed to find their way back. Our next name became one of the most tragic examples of exactly how badly things can go. Few physiques in wrestling history were as iconic or as scrutinized as Hulk Hogan's. The 24-inch pythons and the larger-than-life presence that made him the single biggest star wrestling had ever produced. Hogan's body wasn't just part of his character, it basically was his entire character. For years in the 80s, thousands of fans filled wrestling arenas to watch Hogan flex. The turning point came during Vince McMahon's 1994 steroid trial, when Hogan admitted under oath that he had used steroids for years. It was one of the most consequential moments of the entire steroid scandal that rocked WWE in the early 90s. And it forced Hogan, along with plenty of others, to publicly reckon with how much of his look had been chemically assisted. Almost immediately after that admission, fans noticed a visible change. By the mid-90s, during his WCW run, Hogan looked dramatically smaller than he had during his peak WWF run. He was still in solid shape for a man his age, but the larger-than-life, cartoonish size that had defined him through the 80s was gone for good. As the decades went on, Hogan's physique continued to shrink further. But while Hogan's transformation happened in front of millions, this next wrestler's body gave up before he could even reach the main event status. Before ever signing with the WWE, Chris Hero had built a reputation as one of the most technically gifted wrestlers on the independent scene, working for promotions like Ring of Honor and Combat Zone Wrestling. When he first arrived in NXT in 2012 under the name Cassius Ohno, he was lean and sharp, carrying the look of a dangerous striking technician built for combat. He was released by WWE in 2013, and when he returned to NXT in January 2017, the conversation wasn't about his in-ring work. It was almost entirely about how much heavier he looked compared to his first run. Despite that, Hero continued performing at a high level between both runs, and plenty of critics have pointed out that his skill in the ring never diminished, even as his conditioning became a talking point. While the heavy look might work for some wrestlers like Kevin Owens and Bray Wyatt, it simply didn't suit Hero the same way, and his back injuries made it harder for him to meet WWE's aesthetic standards. But while Chris Hero was never a physique guy, our next wrestler represents the exact opposite extreme. A physique so freakish in its prime that fans still argue about whether it was even humanly possible. In the early 90s, Scott Steiner and his brother Rick were already an imposing tag team tearing through WCW's division. But it was when Scott went solo and transformed into Big Papa Pump that things got totally absurd. His arms alone became a talking point across the entire industry. WCW legend Arn Anderson has said Steiner could have qualified for a Mr. Olympia bodybuilding contest based purely on how he looked at his peak. According to Steiner himself, the transformation wasn't really about adding a dramatic amount of size. In an interview on the Chris Van Vliet podcast, he explained that he didn't get a whole lot bigger. He just got extremely lean and ripped, and the extreme muscle definition created an illusion that made him look even bigger than he actually was. Whatever the real explanation, the Big Papa Pump look became one of the most talked about physiques of the entire Monday Night Wars era. Steiner retired from full-time wrestling years ago and was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2022 alongside his brother Rick. Today, he looks considerably leaner and smaller than the freakish version fans obsessed over in the late 90s. Given how extreme his look was at its peak and how much strain that level of muscularity puts on a body long-term, it's probably one of the smarter outcomes. Steiner's physique may have faded, but his blunt, no-filter commentary has remained just as sharp as ever. And if you want to find out what WWE wrestlers actually eat year-round to maintain their physique, check out this video next.